you've heard me talk about the fourth turning. And I was lucky enough back in 1993, 94, I had the privilege of working with the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And you couldn't do this today, but simultaneously I was working with the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, on the other side. I literally left the White House, went over, passed across the Capitol, and worked on the other side on the same day. And the reason I mention it to you is Bill Clinton was the first person who told me about this book called Generations by Strauss and Howe. And this book was basically 500 years of Anglo-American history, and it showed that history is shaped by generations and generations are shaped by history. It was a fascinating book, and it talked about, the book was written in 1991, that in 2020 there'll be this crisis that we'll be facing, and it was predicted because of how generations raise the next generation, how we then interpret history. You can have events, but they're interpreted differently by a different model of the world. And I thought it was fascinating. And then in 1997, I was going to Borders bookstore, one of those places, and I always go by the bin where the non-popular books are because I'm a contrarian. I found some of my favorite books in those places. And it was in that thing, like marked down 70% or 50%, some ridiculous number. And I picked up the book, and it was Strauss and Howe again. And I picked up this book, and it's been one of the guidebooks for me to understand what the hell's happening in our world ever since. It really helped me understand the patterns. Because if you think about it, we talk about power of patterns. What's the most powerful pattern of all? You've heard me talk about it before, that changed humanity, that took us from starving, running around as hunter-gatherers, to where we could stay in one place. It was one distinction. What was it? Recognizing the seasons. Understanding. See, before that, it was looked random. You planted in the winter. You didn't even know it was winter. You just knew it was cold. And for some reason, you worked your ass off and you got nothing for it. And what I began to look at here is like humanity, once it understood the seasons and knew when to plant and when not to. If you do the right thing at the wrong time, what kind of reward do you get? Zilch, nothing. So all of a sudden, humanity understood this, and now we could stay in one place. We could build a community. We could build cities. We could build countries. That one distinction changed all of humanity. But there's also the seasons of your own life that's so valuable to understand. Think of it as 4 seasons of your life. 0 to 20, roughly, is your springtime. But that initial springtime, you're learning, you're growing, probably protected, you're absorbing things. That's the stage. Some people starts at 16, 14, some say 19, 20, but let's just call it around 21, you enter a different stage of life. You become kind of the soldier of life. You enter the summertime. 21 to 41, that's a different stage, isn't it? Now you go out in the world and say, I'm going to test this stuff. I was told all this shit. What's true? And you think you're going to be a billionaire or 10 times billionaire, and you're going to be president of the United States, and you're going to have 100 relationships, and it's all going to work out smoothly. And then you get your first relationship and discover none of that shit is true. And you start to understand that you have vulnerabilities. You find out you're not invincible. So this young adulthood is testing and discovering, just trying to figure out what's really real. That's when we learn a lot. And usually some of it is painful because it's not quite like we expected. But you're the soldier of society. Quite literally, that's where soldiers are, right? 21 to 41 usually, right? You're the person that goes to war. You're the person that's out there doing the hard work. Now, if you really grew in spring and you really grew in summer, then there's the fall, the autumn. And that means 42 to 62 is a real reaping time if you've grown. If you're not grown, like if you don't plant in the spring, you're going to weep in the fall. You're not going to reap in the fall, right? But if you push through the hot summer, and it's a difficult time, those 21 to 41. By the way, when you ask people, when you do all the research on people, what's the most unhappy time of their life? It's that 2 decades. Not for every human, but for most. Because trying to figure out who the hell you are, prove to yourself, make it through all the bullshit, trying to figure out what's going on in your life. But when you get to 42 to 62, again, if you've grown, if you've not grown, you're kind of stunted. There's not much crop. But now you're really in your midlife power. And you get to start to have a harvest time. This is for a lot of people their greatest financial time of their life because they built up understanding and they worked hard and developed skill sets, and now they're in a position to lead. They might start running an organization. They start to really grow, to expand. And then 63 to 83, you could think of as winter, and 83 to 120 is the oldest living humans. If you're fortunate enough, maybe you'll have an extended winter. But in this stage, you really end up being a leader who's really there to mentor. That's really the position you're in. It's like what I love most now. It's like the example I give you of playing a video game against a child. You know the child's always going to win. And it's not because they're faster or smarter. It's because they played this game a million times. They know the first bad guy's here, the next bad guy's here, the next bad guy's here. So they're able to do something really important. This is what today is all about, if you want it in a simple phrase. Anticipation is power. Anticipation is power. Leaders anticipate. Losers react. If you and I are going to have a great quality of life for our families, for our communities, for anybody we want to serve, our job is to anticipate. In order to do that, you got to recognize patterns. So these seasons of your life are precious. Every season has different challenges, right? How many can remember some of the challenges of the springtime of your life? I remember some of the challenges of the summer in that stage, the things you wrestled with. Some are still there. How many remember the fall experiences, right? So everything has opportunity, everything has challenge, and if you can anticipate the challenge, you can make that season a hell of a lot more enjoyable. So there's the patterns of nature, there's the patterns of your life, the seasons of your life, and what we're going to look at this morning is seasons of history. Because if you understand the seasons of history interact with what stage of life you're in, like some people, 0 to 20 is when they experience winter, historical winter, because there's one about every 80 years, as you'll see shortly. And so some people enter winter in midlife. Some people do it at their power stage. Some people towards the end of life. If you have a full life, you're going to experience all 4 seasons. But all of us in our first 2 seasons of life, meaning your spring, 0 to 20, your 21 to 42, are going to either experience an awakening, an internal turmoil within the country around values, like you saw in the 60s and 70s, or you're going to experience a crisis, right? Because that's the cycle. Everyone experiences them. But depending upon when your generation experiences that shapes the way you look at life, the way you interact, and what you do. But it might be nice to anticipate where that is. So there are these seasons. I just want to give you the big picture. So we got to think of the seasons of nature, the seasons of your life, and the seasons of history. And if you understand them, you start to be able to predict. So this book in 1991 says in 2020, we're going to have this giant crisis, but in the fourth turning, it's even more specific. Here are some of the prophecies that were there as we go to introduce it. That there'll be, 25 years ago, there'll be a global terrorist group that blows up an aircraft. There'll be an impasse of federal budgets that reaches a stalemate with a government shutdown. There'll be anarchy within the former Soviet Republic, and Russia is going to conduct training exercise on its borders. And the CDC is going to announce a new communicable virus that could take down the world. 25 years ago. So I picked up this book. I was so obsessed with it. I flew to meet these 2 authors in their home in Virginia, and I interviewed them for a program I had called Power Talk, where I used to interview people. And so I was 37 years old. I'm now 62. And we have the privilege to have here in person, one of those 2 authors has passed away, but we're here with Mr. Howe. Please give a big hand for one of the great authors, Neil Howe. Thank you, brother. Grab a seat. It's great to have you back. A lot of people have read your book. Some people have not. Let's start at the top. I tried to give the giant pattern to save time so we could get into some of the more deeper pieces, but give people an understanding how this all came about. I mean, you've got expertise as a historian. You've got expertise in finance. Give people a sense, how did you first come across these discoveries together for generations, and then how did Fourth Turning come about?
Yeah, this was back in the late 80s. It was a long time ago. And Bill and I were looking at generational differences. I mean, we're boomers, right? Obsessed with generational differences,
yeah, that's right?
I mean, we all knew that there had been no generation like us since this planet was, first created. So, and we look back, we said, were there other times that this has ever happened? A big Promethean war-winning generation, right, that completely reshaped America. These very self-centered, idealistic kids growing up. And then, of course, at that time, we were aware that this generation coming up after us, cynical, pragmatic, right?
X-Generation.
Generation X really was, they're in it for the money. And they just hated yuppies, They hated disco and they hated yuppies. But we went back and found that this had happened again and again. And not only had it happened before, we went all the way back to the Great Migration into England back in the 1630s and looked at this entire panorama of how many centuries and found again and again, not only were generations very distinct, and people at the time understood that generations were different. This is this myth that, generational differences are just a product of our age. Not true. And what we found that each generation has a different location in history. That makes all the difference because it's how old you are when a big event hits that shapes how you learn about it, right? If you're a child during a big traumatic event, what's your job? What's your social role? Stay out of the way. Don't bother adults. Keep it all to yourself because no one wants to hear your complaints. Be helpful, right? Generally, a lot of repression goes on among kids. Talk about the silent generation today. You ever want to know why Joe Biden's generation, that whole group is so mannerly, so over-socialized, so considerate, so nice? This is the nicest generation of 80-somethings we're ever going to see in our lifetime. You wait until boomers reach their 80s. You're not going to want to say hello to them on the street, okay? But they're nice today.
Yes.
Why? Every phase of life they went through, they've been nice.
Yes.
They were nice 30-somethings. They were nice 40-somethings.
Because they were protected during crisis.
But they had to keep it to themselves. They had to be. They were over-socialized during the time of war. But this has happened since the beginning. Now, if you're just over the age of service, this is why even 1 year of birth.
Explain that. When you wrote your book, I remember reading this grabbed me during the Vietnam War. If you were born December 31st at 11:59 versus January 1st at 12:01, what could the difference be?
You get sorted in different school classrooms, right? That determines which class you are. That determines whether you go to war or not. That determines whether you're laid off at your first job or not. And we know, economists tell us all the time, that makes huge life cycle differences in how you later succeed economically.
Whether you were drafted or not could be determined by 1 minute of birth.
Exactly. So you do have generation. Now, not all generations have this, knife edge division. Occasionally you have these, kind of, zones of transition. You have a lot of early wave millennials today. People in their, early 80s, maybe born 83, 84. They call themselves exennials.
Yes.
Because they're millennials. They're sheltered. They're always taught everything is nice, but they're just old enough to remember when things weren't that sheltered. So, even within generations can be generation of trends. But my main point is that your role of life in your age determines how you react to that event. And then as you move to see older events, that actually determines which events you will likely trigger as you get older and reach the age of leadership. You become leader of a political institution. You become, parents of your family. You're creating decisions in the community. So the overall lesson is history shapes generations young, but then generations as they get older shape history. So it's a complete circle of life you see going on here. In fact, the big lesson of generations is that those seasons of life you're talking about, who you are and how history works is determined by the overlap between your seasons of your life and the seasons of history. So we looked at this. We found that, for instance, we had constantly found that when you have this hero generation, that completely reshapes a society, goes through a major war, society publicly reshapes who it is, that you have this generation born after the war that's very rebellious, idealistic, and so on, and knows nothing but affluence. And then the generation just after them is the cynical, detached. Anyway, you see this again and again. So what we learned from that, Tony, is that this is actually tied to a cycle of history itself. It's not just a cycle of generations, cycle of history. Think about it. The great civic remakings of American history. I mean, if you want to go back, and I'm talking about colonial history too, but one of the first great makeovers of our kind of civic identity, a lot of it happened in England at the time. Of course, at that time, late 17th century, all of the immigrants from the old world were almost entirely English speaking. In fact, a lot of them actually were immigrants. About half of them were still immigrants. But my point is it was a glorious revolution, and there was an enormous rebellion in the colonies too. It all happened in the 1670s, 1680s. That was the first enormous crisis in American history. And it was a time of great war, too. We were at war with New France. The French had settled over Canada. So that was the first great crisis. And then about 80, 90 years later, we had the American Revolution. 80, 90 years later, we had the Civil War. And I think I need not describe what the Civil War was for America, right? But even absolute numbers. Forget share of the population. By far the most deadlier than all the other conflicts combined.
Yes.
And then 80 or 90 years later, the Great Depression, World War II. 80 or 90 years later, guess what? We're right here. We're right here, and we started with the GFC. And you're right. Recent crises have started with economic downturns, and then they later proceed to other kind of system breakdowns. And finally, toward the climax of the crisis, you suddenly decide, the leadership decides, the entire community decides, you have to remake everything. You can't just solve this problem, that problem. It all needs to be remade. And by the end of World War II, FDR was going in his last inaugural address, which was early in 1945. He basically said, total war. Total community, he wasn't hiding it. There was no wordsmiths back then. They were saying, go easy, the public doesn't want to hear the bad news. No, he was saying, there's going to be more danger. There are going to be more deaths. Get ready for it. We're reshaping the world. Things that would have been unimaginable back even in the late 1930s. And by the way, in the late 1930s, most young people were still signing the Oxford Pledge on college campuses, declaring they'll never go to war. Everyone thought about World War I and what a horrible experience that was, right? We'll never go to war. Well, they were all at war now.
Yep.
We're going to remake the world. Commerce is going to be refashioned. World peace is going to be redone. We're going to remake the world, rules of the world, not just of American society. So by the end of that crisis, we reshaped humanity's relationship with technology. My God, we created the A-bomb, which is partly what put an end to the war. So we had atomic technology. We outproduced the rest of the world combined in this country. So we became, as Winston Churchill said at the end of the war, America stands at the summit of the world today, right? I mean, he was amazed. We reshaped the relationship between government and the economy, obviously. We reshaped the political role of citizen and nation. So the GI generation became a generation of citizen soldiers until the day they died. But this huge reshaping, which is even extended to the world, what happened after World War II? Well, we founded, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations. We just, all of these institutions, NATO, all of these things we have today. We have been living for decades on institutions and infrastructure founded then.
Yes.
And by the way, Tony, this reminds me, because you had a question you asked me, right before the event. You said, why don't we solve these problems in better times?
Yes.
Right?
Why don't we wait till it's a crisis?
Why do we wait till it's a crisis? And it's interesting. You can look at all of American history as a series of punctuated equilibriums. We solve all of our problems when conditions are worst. I mean, isn't that ironic?
Yeah.
That's totally counterintuitive. If you ask most people, when do we just choose a problem that you don't like about America today, right? I don't care what it is. I don't care whether it's, we don't enforce immigration laws. Our infrastructure is a disgrace. I mean, you go to foreign countries now, look at their airports compared to our. I mean, it doesn't matter what you do, right? Whether you look at, social services and education today, whether young people are getting fleeced at universities, what used to be an escalator for generational prosperity is now a generator of generational debt for no purpose. But you go in outrage after outrage. Why don't we ever solve these problems? And you're saying, okay, when are we going to do it? Well, maybe on a sunny day. Maybe that's it. We're just waiting for, maybe if partisanship dies down, there's no recession, everything is great, right? If you think about that, all the experts can study it. We all come around the table. You say, okay, yeah, I think at least this one problem will get a solution. Sounds reasonable, right? It never, ever happens that way, Tony. It never happens that way. Yeah. We solve all of these problems not on warm, sunny days. Dark, stormy days is when we solve these problems. We're backed into a corner. There are days like 1776 when Benjamin Franklin was telling all of his friends, we got to hang together or we will all assuredly hang separately.
Yes.
Right? And that's what he was telling everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence. You know what you've just committed, right? You've committed treason. You know what the penalty for that is. Well, why is that? And then at the end of that period, which is one of the worst periods, the 1780s, by the way, was a period of economic depression worse than the 30s, worse than the 30s. We had 150,000 Americans leave. That would be the equivalent of 7 million Americans today. Simply, these are the Tories. I mean, the American Revolution, by the way, was a civil war. It wasn't just a revolution. It was a civil war of American against American. Many of them left, particularly the professional classes.
The loyalists.
Yeah, the loyalists, yeah. And the old economy was in ruins. America actually fled the cities back to the country. That's how bad things were in the 1780s. So what did we do in that crisis? We invented a whole constitution. I mean, that was the miracle of 1787, right? We designed our constitution in that dark hour. And guess what? Over the next several decades, we had growing problems. We had problems with tariffs. We had problems with nullification. We had problems with foreign policy. And above all, we had the whole problem of slavery. Did we do anything about it and all that peace and prosperity that we had? No, we didn't do anything about it. It was all solved in 1861 to 1865 in 4 years of total war. When people were huddling in Washington, D.C., fearful that D.C. was about to be invaded at times. I mean, President Lincoln was suspending habeas corpus. He was rounding up and jailing thousands of people without, illegally, without even telling them what their charges were. So we had a real crisis in America, right?
I remember when I was in junior high school, I had a shop-type teacher, and I remember one day he was reading it, but it reminded me of your book, because one of the great things about Fourth Turning, and if you haven't read it, I still want you to make sure you read it, you'll be reading a passage from an article from the New York Times, and you'll think it's from today, and it's from 80 years ago. And then you'll read another one that's from 160 years ago. Well, I remember he was reading this article, and it was all about we're running out of oil, because I was growing up in the 70s and there were, lines. Some of you are old enough to remember. You had the license plate. I didn't have a car yet, but I didn't think I was ever going to have one, because, the number on the back, odd or even, determined whether you could get gas that day. That's how bad it was, right?
Remember.
And so he read this whole article from the New York Times about oil, we're out of oil, and the darkening of the world, and how the whole world's going to go to shit. And at the end, it was from 80 years before, and it was whale oil, when we were based on whale oil. And he's like, I'll never forget him saying, necessity is the mother of invention. When we have to, we find answers. And by the way, how many of you found that in your own life? When you have to, right? That's when most people do it. Now, we work to do it more proactively. But crisis creates a breakthrough. If it doesn't kill you, it creates a breakthrough. And historically, that's been true. Like, what's the purpose of crisis? In essence, is what you're telling us. The purpose of crisis is that's how we transform.
It is how we transform. But there is a different nature to the transformation as you go through the saculum, right?
Yes, please walk through that if you.
Yeah, because I think we need to focus on that.
I think so too.
So coming out of the crisis, you go into what we call the high. That's the spring, right? The high, like the American high. That was actually William O'Neill, famous U.S. historian. He actually described the years 1946 to 1964 as the American high. And I think many of you, if you haven't lived through it, like I did as a kid, you kind of know what I'm talking about. A period when the nation felt very optimistic, but in a certain way. And by the way, African Americans is interesting. Terrible period for them from the vantage point of the civil rights era, from the vantage point, but actually in terms of economic achievement, one of the best periods ever for African Americans, right? In terms of, gains in family. They moved out of the South, for one thing, during World War II. It's the single best thing that ever happened to them. And anyway, but a great time for America in many ways. It was a time of terrific conformity. You didn't want to be someone left out of the mainstream. That was true. But it was also a time, and I think we so much miss this today, when people felt that collectively there were more than the sum of their parts. And I think today, Tony, coming out of the third turning, kind of the opposite end, and still today, early in the fourth turning, we feel that collectively we are less than the sum of our parts. Yes. How often do people say there are such talented individuals out there? I mean, any of us getting around, they say, any of us can do better than the jackasses they have there in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's incredible, the incompetence and the dysfunction. How is it that they can be so bad and just take any random group of 5 of you and put you all together and say, we can agree on shit, right? So how does that happen? And it's a very different kind of problem. And that explains why we have awakenings and why we have crises. The awakening is to release the individual. That's what we do in awakenings.
So the winter gets us to come together to fight the battle. We become optimistic because we don't go through that crap anymore, and we're unified, and we have this high, and everything grows. But we lose the individual. So now the individual needs to pop up. That's our summertime. That's when there's internal strife.
It's a very different kind of transformation. Now, the generation that sometimes has a hard time with the awakening is the silent generation, because they're all, socialized to be conformist, socialized to go along. So they're torn, right? They're torn. Gen Xers are torn too today, but they're torn in the opposite direction. Because Gen Xers, and a lot of you are Xers, I define Xers as born 1961 to 1981, birth year. You look at the census. Census Bureau defines boomers as born 1946 to 1964. The census did it just to reflect fertility rates. We're talking about social generations. We go through a lot of reasons why 1943 to 1960 makes a lot more sense. So we defend that. We still do. So what Xers need to do, Xers are raised in an awakening. You put it rightly. No one gave a damn about them. They were latchkey kids. Their parents were, discovering themselves. A lot of them had silent generation parents going through their midlife passages and suddenly wondering, my God, I suddenly discovering myself. And boomers were just having fun, right? And the entire country was into self. This was, the self-revolution.
Yeah, me generation.
And so Xers are kind of left alone, and they raise themselves, right? And so Xers have been very used to, in their lives, just running their own lives and solving problems themselves, maybe with little groups of friends or little workable arrangements if they have to. And that leads to the pragmatism and the cynicism of big, broad national causes. They've never worked for them. And by the way, all these big institutions supposed to help everyone never helped them. I mean, no one gave a damn about kids when they were young. And as soon as they started graduating from high school in first ones, 1981, 1982, Nation at Risk report came out, which declared that this nation has never had such a generation of dumb kids as Gen Xers. So Gen Xers are these dumb kids, they're left alone, under-socialized, the opposite of silent generation, right, over-socialized. Yep. And they said, that's okay, that's all right, you don't have to like us. We're just going to go on and get things done our own way. And one of our goals is to stay off the community's radar screen, because the last thing we want to do is to get regulated, taxed, identified, you know what I mean? So you have Xers are the natural individualists because of the way they've been raised, because of the season in which they grow up. And you see this again and again in history. You were a child during awakenings. You're used to taking life one-on-one on your own.
Yep.
So where the problem with the silent was moving from the group is everything. The group, in the silent generation in the 50s, everything was about adjusting yourself to meet the expectations of others. As Dale Carnegie and, being the kind of person that others wanted you to be. So it was all about the other-directed self, the social ethic. The opposite was true for Xers. just do your own thing, right? Do, just obey your thirst. I don't know, whatever the hell it was.
Just do it.
Just do it. So you got this extras, right? Pragmatic, take care of themselves. But they have to undergo the opposite adjustment. And by the way, the peers of John Adams and George Washington had to do the same thing. And the peers of George Patton and Harry Truman had to do the same thing. These were both craggy, pragmatic, individualistic children, left alone. They came of age during the Roaring 20s, a lot of them. They tended to be Republican all their lives, by the way, the lost generation. They detested a big state and everything. But they had to figure out what the hell they were going to do during World War II. Everyone was banding together. How does an individualist grow up or adjust at a time when community is refining itself? We are now at a time when groups are refining themselves. We're at a time of growing tribalism in America. And we're at a time when everyone is going back to the groups. I'll tell you one sign of that. Extended generation families. They're everywhere today. Everyone is reverting back into the extended family, right? Millennials, Gen Xers used to boomerang back home. Millennials don't boomerang back home. They just never leave. and now you've got older people coming back to live at home, aunts and uncles, everyone. Why is it that larger homes have had their prices go up and they're not coming back? Remember with millennials, originally we said it would be the mini homes that would go up more in price.
They said they never buy real estate. They're not going to form families. I remember people saying that, going, you don't understand generations. And now they're buying like crazy.
But not only they're buying, and very often moving with their parents, but they want larger homes.
Yes.
And people did not anticipate. So larger homes. Look at neighborhoods now. Look at political tribalism, which is growing unbelievable today in America, right? Red zone, blue zone, these are now mega brands. And people are self-sorting across America into these things. This is what's
Before you go further, I want you to help the X generation in this room understand the millennials here, because the X generation was underprotected. And again, I was that stage. I was 1960, but I have the memories somewhere in my psyche, probably because it was recapped every year in those days, of Kennedy and the optimism of that time. Because I was 3 years old when it was happening. But I was raised by myself. I had to raise myself. I had to figure it out. So I had this optimism, but the pragmatism. But the way you raise your children usually as a whole is different, because since you were underprotected, that became baby on board. If you looked at movies in the 70s, babies were very different. They were like evil little bastards. Like it was Rosemary's Baby, right?
That's absolutely
It was
right.
The Omen. Yeah. It was, somebody's head twirling around The Exorcist. And suddenly it's 3 men and a baby on board. Talk a little bit about that transition and why millennials are the way they are, because they've done nothing wrong. They've just been raised differently.
The golden age of child as devil horror movies really lasted from about 1965 to about 1982. So exactly when Xers were small kids. That was the most negative image of small kids in American history. There were no G-rated movies. There was not even, you had to drive 500 miles just to find Benji. But my point was, so that was what was going on. And the phrase, you can do an Ngram search if you want, but the phrase, children are special, was literally no mention going all the way up through the late 60s, 1970 until about 1977, 78. No one ever wrote that phrase in a published work. So suddenly it began rising, and after 1982 or 3 with millennials, it just goes into the stratosphere, right? So suddenly millennials are surrounded in these cuddly baby movies and these signs of baby on board and minivans with 12 different ways to buckle the precious kids into their seats. Back when Xers are small, you just told kids to do this. That was good enough. But so all of this has changed. But this shapes generations permanently. Here's the thing. Archaeologists know this. You can take a tree, you can cut the tree down, and you can look at the rings on a tree and look at the widths of the rings on a tree. And you can tell when that tree had, a really lush spring and summer, a lot of water, a little thin ring. That's when it went through the drought. We are all like that. We are all like trees. And very often, if you're a certain age, by the way, any tree you cut down all has the same kind of rings, right? It all has the same ring pattern because they all went through the same thing. So it's the same thing. Generations are like trees in that respect. And we all internalize. We have a record inside ourselves of when you went through these different seasons.
Yes.
But the big challenge is, again, I want to come back to this because this is a challenge of the crisis. You look around the world today. By the way, this isn't just America. Why is the whole world moving away from sort of individualistic liberal democracy where everyone's individual rights are protected? The whole world is moving toward populism, moving toward guarantees for the group. You talk to millennials, they want security, they want community. They don't want that rugged individualism that a lot of Xers, recall, right? It's a shift in perspective. And
they were also raised, there's a great book called The Coddling of America that if you haven't read it, you should also read by Jonathan
Haidt.
Haidt. And he goes through and shows that it started with babies at that stage not only being taught you got to be safe every moment. Safety wasn't a question before. Right, but now everything is about your safety and your security. And on the milk cans or the milk bottles that most people did for their cereal every morning was a child that was missing. They started that during that time. And they never told you the kids were found or that it was stolen by the father who's, just got the divorce. So all that was is constant fear and uncertainty. And then the constant piece, it magnified that when we got to the point of social media when around 2010, all of a sudden everybody's got an iPhone, and now there's a different world where constantly they're being reinforced to be a certain way. Right? So it creates a radically different culture. But I want to plant a seed for the millennials right now so you hear it. The millennials are our next heroes. They will, when we hit this next crisis, just like the flappers, the ones we talked about, great generation, I have great excitement for the millennials because they have a different level of relationship to technology, of networking. I'd like to make sure we talk about that. They're really going to be an important part of the solution.
But they also have a different relationship with each other.
True.
And that's the point. And that's how they differ from Xers. Millennials really get it. They believe in doing everything as a community. And they believe that people need a simple set of rules, prescriptions. Let's just follow the same rules. That way we avoid any of these problems. Let's just get everyone on the same page. And by the way, if a certain group of people refuses to be on the same page, and I was going to talk about this eventually, conflict.
Yes.
Let's have it out.
That's right.
Because it has to happen, it's going to happen.
Because they see it as immoral or wrong. If you have a different point of view, there's something wrong with you. It's not we have different points of view. My view is the way. Your point of view shouldn't be. There shouldn't be free speech. Who in their lifetime thought we'd be hearing that from liberals? But we're all about free speech.
But this is going on around the world. You look at, I don't know whether you're in everywhere around Xi Jinping in China, Narendra Modi in India. You go look at Abe Shinzo and sort of the transformation in Japan. But you look increasingly at Europe. Le Pen, unbelievably, she's probably one election away from winning in France. But my point is all of these societies are becoming more populist around a kind of cultural, social center of gravity in the nation. No one really cares so much about the marginalized groups anymore. Everyone is focusing on the majoritarian center. Let's get the rules right for them so at least basic things work again. That's happening all around. And we sometimes think it's just America that has this problem. It's not. This generational pattern now increasingly involves much of the world.
And the ones that were raised that way, the older millennials are now around 40 years old, so they're the ones writing for the Washington Post and for the New York Times. They're the ones that are on television doing that. So they're entering positions of power and influence, and they're bringing the value systems that they've learned and grown up with to the world and expecting the rest of the world to be that way.
And by the way, just to point out, you saw the same thing happen during the 1920s. So you're right about the 1990s. While Xers were out enjoying, grunge and Nirvana and thrash metal and just doing all that stuff, it was totally transgressive, and the damaged font advertisements and everything was so Xer, right? Millennials were watching, Barney and his friends and, Blue's Clues. And they were going to this huge renaissance of Disney, movies, like Lion King and all that. So they were enjoying this very protected culture, even while young adults were all into their wildness. You saw the same thing happening in the 1920s. So during the 1920s, when the older generation, young adults, were the flappers and they're doing barnstorming and rum running and all the things that the veterans who came back from World War I were doing. The peers of Hemingway and Fitzgerald. I mean, they were a wild crowd, and they drank a lot. So they were a wild generation. They put the roar into the Roaring '20s. But meanwhile, the kids were being protected. The first Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls, 4-H clubs. And by the time you had, for 20-year-olds, the first Miss Americas in 1923, we were building huge college stadiums for the younger generation, right? So this would have been the equivalent of the millennials. And they were all becoming used to the spirit of optimism, cooperation, national unity. So finally, when we had the Great Crash, a huge plurality of them voted for FDR.
Yes.
And they voted for the New Deal.
That's right.
And so the New Deal was incredibly favored by younger people. Just like, I mean, you all seen the polls. You see how, millennials all vote for the Democratic Party. Xers are now actually arguably the most pro-Republican group out there, and like the last generation, who was always, lean more to the Republican Party. But what Xers need to do is adjust themselves to this new communitarian ethos, because one way or another, they're going to have to live with it, right? That's where the country's going. And I think that's going to be the interesting transformation. And so people who are into personal transformation. So, in fact, I was going to ask you, Tony. It was actually one of my questions that I came with my own list, too. So the question I was going to ask, you're a person who has spent your entire career, really, perfecting to an unequaled level, in my opinion, personal transformation. I mean, I wonder, but I'm sure you would disagree. How can you take it any further than you've taken it? But I know you have things you still want to do, right? But in other words, and a lot of your base has always been Xers, right?
Yes.
And that's what they're into: personal,
Boomers
individual transformation. Yeah, boomers and Xers.
Yeah.
What about your next stage? Collective transformation.
Yeah, I think when we do that, that's what we do with groups, because we create that collective value system. How many know what I'm talking about? Like at a date with destiny and like that. So
yeah, exactly.
Millennials find it very comfortable as far as that's concerned. And everyone wants to grow, but millennials are also entering a stage, just like they said they weren't going to buy houses. And I remember saying, you're idiots to say that. They're not. They look like they're going to buy houses. They're going to buy homes. But what's the different about it is, like you said, a bigger home, a different environment. But now they're entering that stage of life, 40 years old, 35 years old, where they start evaluating. In my experience, transformation in the 20s, you think you're, as I said earlier, you're invincible. When you get to your mid-30s and you have relationships, and then all of a sudden you have a family, and then you have kids, and then all of a sudden things look differently. So I'm seeing that group just as responsive as previous groups, but they like doing it collectively, less individualistic. And they want it done a certain way. They don't want to be unsafe.
You have a problem in America where public speech has become so coarse,
or comedy,
so wild, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I saw, even in reaction to this, recent school shooting in Texas,
yes.
Congressmen are trading F-bombs with each other on Twitter. Congressmen. I mean,
and blaming each other while kids have just died.
Right, but the point is, the level of discourse is degraded to such a point. Yes. And it reminds me, by the way, of the 1850s. We had the same thing. We had congressmen actually shooting and knifing each other, in the middle, and we know where that went. It went to war. Yeah. But my point is that this level of incivility, what happens after the crisis with a generation that actually has to fight it, they clean up everything. Language is homogenized. You look at language, political language of the people after actually fighting World War II, particularly by the 1950s, early 1960s, It's all homogenized, cleaned up. It's your Walter Cronkite.
Yes.
You know, good morning, America. Everything was great today.
Yeah.
But so this has a cycle too.
Because after a crisis, there's so much pain, people want something completely new.
Yes. And this is why identity politics after the crisis is never an issue.
Yeah.
Because no one cares about your own individual identity anymore. After what we all did together to get through this thing, your own little identity doesn't matter. And by the way, these are all the great melting pot periods of American history.
Yes.
I mean, you went through World War II. You were no longer a hyphenated American.
That's
you
right.
were no longer an Italian American, a Polish American. We had all those Eastern European hyphenated. They were all just Americans.
Think about cultural appropriation, that term that's been created.
Yeah,
I mean, America is nothing but a melting pot. Everything we do has come from somewhere else. And we used to honor that and think it was a beautiful thing. Now it's part of the crisis creation is that sense of division. And if you look at Ray Dalio, and many of you know Ray, and he's talking about, the changes in the world order that come, there's 3 principles that determine that. 1, are you spending more than you're earning or earning more than you're spending, right? We're obviously spending way more than we're earning. Number 2, level of internal conflict in the country. And number 3, a rising power. Well, rising power takes advantage because your economics are gone and you're completely divided. And that's unfortunately where this country is. Now, it doesn't mean it has to stay there, but that's where this country is right now. So tell us a little bit about, I want to go into the crisis in a second, but I want you just, if you would, you use Jungian archetypes, and you kind of alluded to them a little bit here. And what I found interesting about that is, for example, boomers, when they started out, were very permissive, and then later in life they become very moralistic and very intense. Many people start out one way and end up a different way. Can you explain those 4 archetypes and how you see them attached to these generations that we're familiar with, and all generations you've seen, and how they start one way and why do they become sometimes almost the opposite?
So, yes, we attach to these 4 types of generation archetypal names. So for the generation that is born right after the crisis, we call them the prophet archetype, and that would be, for instance, boomers. But we've had many other examples.
Yes.
The original Puritans were actually an example of a prophet archetype generation.
And what are the qualities of a prophet?
So their life cycle, I think you're familiar with. Indulgently raised in a very secure era. They come of age during these times of spiritual awakening, a lot of protest, a lot of social divisions, and they break through. They try to, they want to individualize the country. They want to free individuals from this sort of tyranny of the collective that everyone's been enslaved with. And they don't understand why we had a collective. You had to have gone through the war to understand that, right? And they didn't go through it. That's why they're different. So they want to free everyone from that. And then they go through the fall season, which is a period of individualism. This would have been like the late 80s, the 90s, the early 00s.
Also when financial markets go crazy, opportunity like that goes crazy at those times.
Right. And it's the time, and recently it's true. I mean, you go into any bookstore, you look at all the books in a bookstore, and all the upbeat and positive books are all about me, myself, and I. All the great things I'm going to do with all the downbeat books now in bookstores, and this has been this way for the last 25 years, are all about who we are collectively. The decline of the family, the decline of the nation, the decline of schools, the decline. But they become more moralistic during this period.
Yes, and why is that? They go from very crazy, almost individualistic and permissive, to moralistic and controlling.
Because they realize that those idealistic principles aren't really being realized. Mm-hmm. So the moralism starts, and then they become the moralistic elders of the crisis. We sometimes call them gray champions, right?
Yes.
FDR was that. Lincoln was that, right? Sam Adams was that. And then the Xer generation is the nomad archetype, right? Nomad, alone, right? Individual. All of life is just kind of a one-on-one encounter. I find I used to teach history to Gen Xers, and I found the only way to interest Gen Xers in history was to have them read biography. They all understood a life of an individual. That I can understand. Tell me about social trends and all that stuff. That makes no sense to me. I don't have anything in common with. But you tell me about an individual struggle. I get it, right? So they're the nomad archetype.
What are their qualities?
Their qualities are, and then their background, underprotected to sort of taking life as an individual, pragmatism, cynicism, get things done really well, break things down to their simplest components. I think efficacy in sort of execution is their strength. And by the way,
the generation before often will create breakthroughs, but the people who make those breakthroughs real is that nomad generation. They're the ones that perfect it and refine it. They take Microsoft and it's built, but these guys come in and they take it to the next level, Google, whatever.
Nomad are the generations. We're very lucky to have nomad, by the way. Our nation really hinges on them because they are the ones in midlife during the crisis. They determined whether we actually get through the damn thing alive. And while these old Aquarians, sometimes want to blow up the world, right?
Because they're moralistic,
they're
right?
Moralistic, yeah.
Let's just kill Putin,
yeah.
Right? But no matter what it means to the rest of the world, it means global war. The X generation's like more pragmatic about it, and this generation is the one in real leadership position in crisis.
They are the generals. They are the ones who are actually the hands-on leaders, right? And they were we were talking about them earlier. They were the Omar Bradleys, the General Prattons, the Dwight D. Eisenhowers, laconic prose, just everything to the point, right? Or, Harry Truman, who never had a comma in any of his sentences. Just, very simple utterances, right? So, always to the point, though, right? And then you have the next one is the hero generation, and we know their strengths. Community.
That's millennials.
Achievement. And it's the GI generation. And it's the Republican generation that created the United States of America, right? Yes. That fought the American Revolution and created the Constitution. Now, they are wonderful because they create these long-term institutions. They're institution defenders. They represent the community. They represent always optimism, the triumph of technology, but technology together, not like nomad technology. It's an individual cell phone. No, the GI generation, technology was always infrastructure that reformed our public spaces. We hardly have a concept of that anymore. And probably during the crisis, we'll have to actually rebuild that infrastructure.
Yes.
Right. And then finally, the artist archetype. These are the
should be the Z generation now.
Or the silent generation.
Silent generation, which in other words, these are people that during the war, during the crisis, they're protected. Their job is just shut up and deal with it because you're being supported by the elders that are fighting the war.
And they developed very early on an ear for sensitivity, for fairness. So very often the generation that's young develops a talent for the things that older generations aren't perceiving.
Yes.
And that's what's fascinating to me. And you see that today, by the way, among the group of kids I call Homelanders or Generation Z. You find that they're very caring. They're very much into kindness. In a world today which is all into cancel culture and screaming everyone down, and the world is being divided into these black and white groups, or I should say red and blues groups. And a world, half of Americans today believe a civil war is very likely. This wasn't even on the radar screen 10 years ago. Yeah. Half of America is saying that. And we see, too, the possibilities of global war now rising. So we're at this place now. This younger generation senses that. And that's why they're into nuance, kindness, seeing the kinds of distinctions which are lost on older generations. The silent generation is the same way, by the way. So these are the different archetypes. And a couple
they keep rotating.
And they keep rotating. And a couple of them are big. I mean, you look at Joseph Campbell, who wrote about myth. And, Lucas with Star Wars, and we know was done on Joseph Campbell. But you see in myth, every phase of life is occupied in the same order as we're talking about historically. You always find that the young hero, like Arthur, always has a much older wizard, like Merlin, who helps him, right? So there's always the prophet archetype in old age when the hero is coming of age, right? And then when it's reversed, when it's the other way, when you have an elder hero and a young prophet, that's the storyline of the founding of religions, right? That's more like Orpheus or Jesus or Buddha, or you're right, it's like Pontius Pilate or Hammurabi, who's sort of this, very secure but spiritually soul dead world. And a young awakener, a young prophet challenging that, speaking truth to power. Now, they're both heroes, but in almost opposite direction.
Yes.
One is reshaping the inner world. The other is reshaping the outer world. The hero reshapes the outer world, the realm of kingdoms, the realm of society, making new collective infrastructure. The prophet is reshaping the inner world of culture. By the way, in America today, when we talk about politics, we always say post-war, right? We say, oh, yeah, that's the way political institutions have been post-war. We mean World War II. We talk about culture, we talk about since the 60s.
That's right.
And that's how we periodize things, depending on whether you're talking about inner world or outer world.
Tell us, where do you see us now? 2008, you see as the beginning of the winter, the crisis period. It started with finance. We didn't really solve it. We just printed more money. And now we're starting to get around the end of that aspect. Usually, traditionally, there's some form of war. Is that a war with China? Is that a cyber war? I mean, no one knows for sure, obviously, but tell us what your point of view is of where we are in the cycle and how long does winter last? Is this another 7 or 8 years based on history?
I think that the phases of life are actually getting broader recently. We actually see a dilation in phases of life. Kids are taking longer to become adults. I mean, you all know that. I don't know to remind you. They're probably still living with you, right? Anyway, and then you see people are political leaders at older and older ages. I mean, look at Pelosi, look at Biden. We've never seen people at that age. So, in other words, phases of life are dilating. And remember, it's the length of a phase of life that determines generational length. So, and it also determines turning length. So we think that after actually compressing for the last century and a half, they're actually beginning to dilate now.
So in earlier history, things might have been a 25-year season. They've gone back to kind of a 20, and you see it starting to expand.
It's starting to dilate. So we think this next, this fourth turning we're currently in, starting in 2008, will probably last till around early 2030s.
Wow.
And so we have a ways to go. I think almost certainly we're going to have more. All of these periods are characterized by an enormous degree of financial and economic instability, not just the opening crash, like the crash of 29, the crash of 2008, but also during the period. I talked about the 1780s before. What about the recession of 1936? The stock market went down in 1936 by 55%. I mean, and by the way, inflation. I mean, you were talking about inflation during fourth turnings. We haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that Jerome Powell is not going to stop. I think he's going to go all the way. So it's kind of an interesting game there.
Do we end up with a recession?
Well, the only way he's going to be able to suppress demand is by creating a recession. I don't think there's any question about that. And so that will bring, interest rates down. That will bring it. But then you have a problem where Congress isn't going to be able to do anything either. This is going to be like Volcker without the Novocaine, right? Congress will not be able to help, right? Congress will not be able to create those huge deficits while Fed monetary policy is squeezing inflation out of the system. And by the way, we now have a very small generation coming into the workplace, very large generation leaving. So over the 2020s, there is zero net growth in working age population. I just want to remind you that zero net growth. During the 1980s, when Reagan was there and Volcker was doing his thing, we had 1.5% per year of just increased working age people, right? Yes. So we have a demographic situation, a monetary policy situation, and an inability of Congress to act. I'll tell you why Congress can't act, why Congress cannot do any stimulus, which you'd think they would, right? The reason is because debt is so high. I mean, debt is now up to about 104, 105% of GDP, right? That's where we were at the end of World War II.
Yes.
That's where we've done just since 2008. We went from 35% to over 100% of GDP at deficit, but we didn't fight a total war. God knows what we did, but we're there. The future deficit projections that CBO does, and by the way, I review this to all my clients. I do this once a year, so I go over them all. 30-year CBO projections, they're hugely dependent now on interest rate assumptions. As those real interest rate assumptions go up and inflation expectations goes up, those things balloon to infinity. So guess what? At the same time, while Jerome Powell is increasing those interest rates, increasing, and everyone's suddenly acknowledging those inflation expectations that are going into effect, that will completely spike any hope that Congress has of running any deficits, because we're dependent on foreign investors to keep buying our bonds. We have about 40% of U.S. treasuries are owned by foreigners today.
So you're going to have a period of inflation in products and probably deflation of assets simultaneously.
Yeah, this is very bad, and you have to be very careful. And I don't know if someone's going to talk about this later about where to invest in a forward turning. But
tell us your perspective.
Well, first of all, get out of nominally denominated fixed income assets. That's the first thing, because those are ruined by inflation.
Bonds.
And you would have done better if you had gotten out of them about 6 months ago. But they still don't look good. So you get out of those. And the whole business of sort of the parity arrangement where, you do stocks and bonds together because when one rises, the other goes down, that's completely collapsing now. So that's no longer true. So basically you get out of that. And then you get out of all the high risk stuff. You get out of high beta, high leverage. You kind of go down the list of everything that's sort of bad for you, and then you also get out of stuff that probably isn't going to do well in the future, like the communications sector and stuff, which is just tremendously overvalued. Basically, high multiples is the other thing you look for. So you get out of that, and what do you get into? You get into things. You get into commodities, you get into real estate, and you get into sectors that are probably undervalued in a fourth turning. Manufacturing, materials, and possibly energy. I think energy is actually looking good now, particularly because everyone's being forced to get out of it. Makes it kind of a buy. We obviously have a problem. God knows what's going to happen to food prices. But if you're in materials, that means producing ammonia. You know what ammonia is used for, and energy is needed for agriculture. So if you want to talk about energy to keep us warm and food to keep us fed, I mean, you're talking about those sectors. You obviously, all the other things apply. Diversify yourself everywhere. The most important thing, though, in a fourth turning is to know where your investments are. Be very wary of stuff where you don't know what the hell it is. I'm talking about if you understand, Web3 or NFTs, or if you really want to spend and if you really think you understand, Bored Apes, Yacht Club, go ahead. But
anybody see what the overall price of NFTs has come to?
Yeah,
down 90% right now.
Yeah. So anyway, I've never recommended that. But my point is, get out of that stuff because you don't know where your money is. By the way, the whole valuation of that was generated by negative real interest rates. We're unlikely to see that again, right?
What are the most important things we can do to prepare and anticipate?
Personally, other than the financial side, your family. That's number one. Just know who your family is. Get back on good relations with people that you may have, not had been on.
And your chosen family as well, right?
Exactly. Your chosen family. Everything about, your sort of elective community. I mean, whoever you're living with, because that will become very important.
Your network will be everything. the real network, not a fake network, not a Facebook network, but the network of people that you can count on and
Real
count
people.
on you.
Exactly. And if you don't have one, find one. Generate one. Reputation matters in a fourth turning. And by the way, conventional values come back in a fourth turning. Look at any fourth turning. The songs that become popular, the movies, they're corny, they're schmaltzy, they're reaffirming. No one's transgressing anymore in a fourth turning. There's no benefit in that. No one gives a damn about all that stuff anymore, right? And so if you look at the kinds of movies that were big in the late 30s or certainly during World War II, and art itself, culture transforms into propaganda. Hollywood moved to Washington during World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone needed to make something that was for the cause. We all became used to that. So this is something, millennials, by the way, are well primed for that.
Yes.
They all understand art for the cause,
Yes.
right? So this is also important. And I think also one other thing is, and this is very important for all the Xers out there, you need to get back in touch with the official community, authorities in your area, who the politicians are, who actually is on the committees that actually create the regulations that affect your industry. One thing that's very important in every fourth turning is being able to influence and talk to the people that are redrafting and re-legislating all of the laws and regulations going to reshape your industry.
All the way down to the school boards.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, well, we've seen that recently, right? But you need to know, because politics can reshape your world overnight in a fourth turning. You need to be connected. And I know a lot of Xers say, I hate politics. I hate all those guys. I mean, everything they do is just, ruins everything, certainly in my life. But this is survival. Think about it that way. So just think of it as an Xer survival code.
So who you know is pretty critical. Who you have a relationship is really critical.
Exactly. So these are the things that I think are important.
How do we know when we're coming out of a fourth turn? By the way, now that we've uplifted you all with your future, compelling future, but isn't it better to know and anticipate than to get struck and react? Yes? So the question is, what follows a fourth turning is a new awakening, a new time, a new springtime, right? A new high, a new optimism. How do we know when we've turned the corner out of this fourth turning that we're in right now?
That will be like a flat. You will know. You know why? Because every fourth turning, its final climax, is absolutely history changing. So toward the end of the fourth turnings can sometimes build, like the 30s did, like this one is. It's building, right? It's this crescendo of interest. And by the way, every election today is a national election. So this isn't like the 1990s when you could just be a kind of a flaky third-party candidate or so, and just sort of a no. Everything now is you're either red zone or blue zone. I don't care if you're running for dog catcher, you're running for on the school board. It's all now polarized because the only thing that matters now. By the way, it's not like the 1990s. There are a lot of arguments, people trying to persuade other people to change your mind. I'm in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's where I am, politics. No one in D.C. is anymore arguing with each other. Why? They've already made up their minds. They've made up their minds. There's no, and it's amazing. Do you think that, so Tip O'Neill and...
Those guys used to fight like hell in Congress and go have a beer together.
Yeah.
Now they don't speak to the other side.
They don't speak. They don't socialize. They have nothing to talk about. They have and you can understand they have nothing to talk about. They're in completely different worldviews, and their visions of America's future are mutually exclusive, right? And by the way, this is the danger point for civil war. You talk to Barbara Walter, who's the biggest, she just wrote a book on it. She's the biggest scholar of civil wars. And she goes around the world. I mean, she went to Rwanda. She went to, Cambodia. She's been to certainly all around, all the stands, and then down in Africa and so on. She says, no one ever sees it coming. She's interviewed, I don't know how many people. She said they never think it's going to happen in their country, right? And this
you've seen this country become more regional, people moving en masse to where they're more aligned with other people, whether it be blue states or red states.
If you poll people today, you will find that of all the people they don't want to live with, right? This is more than living with next to someone of another religion, another race, another. It doesn't matter. What about? But I don't want to live with a person politically the opposite of I am, because I just will not be able to get along with that person. So this is the level of polarization. And again, if you don't know history, you don't know where we've been. Go back and read about the 1850s, how all of America became separated. The churches in America separated in the late 1840s. And then suddenly the national political parties died. I mean, first it was the Whig Party that went out in the early 1850s. In 1858, it was the Democratic Party that basically disintegrated. So by 1860, you just simply had purely regional parties. And that was before the Civil War started. So think about it. This is happening. We see this happening, this possibility. Now, the other possibility is external conflict. We see that rising as well, given all these new populous nations around the world. And, they're all, by the way, run with post-crisis leaders like Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi. They're all born after, these are great champions, right? So the possibility of global conflict is also rising. Now, which will it be? It could be totally one, totally the other, or sometimes a little of both. American Revolution is a little of both. We were fighting Americans against Britain, but it was also Americans against Americans at the same time.
The loyalists versus the revolutionaries.
The 1930s had a strong, almost Civil War component. I mean, the 1930s are terrible. I mean, cities were full of violence, Pinkertons against communists and socialists, on the unions, particularly when you had the sit-down strikes in the late 50s. By the way, back then, Republicans could truthfully claim that young adults were card-carrying communists and socialists. They really were. They were joining the Communist and Socialist Party during the Great Depression, and they could truthfully claim that the other side, once it captured government, would try to reshape the country, which it did with the New Deal. So any of you complain about millennials, it could have been worse. You could have had young GIs, and they did. A lot of them joined, strong leftists.
So after a crisis, there's usually, in the summertime, the awakening, there's a cultural change. After a crisis, there is a change worldwide, the structure, how the world relates to each other. What do you see? What is your view of where we are and where we're heading? What's the timeline of these things that you're seeing? And what makes you optimistic on the other side of this? Because it might be helpful if people know that no war goes forever, even though it may sound forever. No pandemic, as we said, goes on forever. No night is forever. There's always the daytime, right? And it always follows it, thank God. So tell us a little bit about what you see happening, and then what's the other side look like?
You cannot know in advance, such as the chaotic nature. There are certain patterns you can tell. You can tell the timing of this whole thing, when it will get worse, when it will resolve, and so on. But internal versus external,
you don't know that.
You can't predict, because it could flip one way or the other, interestingly, as we saw in the 30s to the 40s. I mean, who would have predicted that? Who would have predicted that after the second New Deal and after FDR would go Madison Square Garden jammed with 10,000 people, and he would get up there and he says, I know that the capitalists and the robber barons, they hate me, and all these Republicans, they hate me. And he said, I glory in their hatred, and there were 10,000 people screaming. That was the partisanship in 1936. And by the way, when Roosevelt won, Republicans were almost completely wiped out in Congress. I mean, there were only like 14 Republican senators left in the Senate. I mean, so in other words, we're talking about what happened back then.
Yes.
We could be seeing that again. And would you have predicted that at the end of that, we wouldn't be in a civil war, but we'd end up completely unified? And that's how fast collective identities can change as you get toward the end of a fourth turning. It's a very dynamic period, right? So, timing. We are right now, look, both political parties are leaderless, right? I mean, we've got a Republican Party that doesn't know where the hell it is right now. And, we got Trump, he's sort of out there, and we got DeSantis, we got Cotton, and we got all these people. We don't know. The Democratic Party, leaderless. I think it's fairly certain now from everyone I talked to in Washington, D.C., Biden is not going to run for a second term. and you've got, no one is even thinking about the vice president. So essentially, you have a Democratic Party that's leaderless, a Republican Party that's now essentially leaderless. It's open. And one question you asked me, actually, before we went on, the identity of a leader. The identity. Yes. Where do leaders come from?
Yes.
One thing I've learned from Fourth Turnings, to answer that ancient question, are leaders born or are they made? One thing about Fourth Turnings is they are made. They are made. Leaders are not born. Teddy Roosevelt, who was Franklin Roosevelt's, fifth cousin, uncle kind of thing. He was a man of vastly more capacity, intelligence, energy than Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, he was a dynamo. Everyone thought that Theodore Roosevelt was like a phenomenon, a god on earth. The guy would read, 2 books a day. He would be out, chasing rhinoceroses with his gun. I mean, he was just an amazing phenomenon. He did galvanize the country, but he was unable to put through any kind of major changes. It wasn't the right season, right?
Right.
Franklin Roosevelt, no one thought much of him. I mean, he was not a great intellect, actually. He did have an amazing capacity to make friends and empathize. And I think polio was part of that. Right? Mm-hmm. That was a personal crisis which really transformed him in a very beneficial way. He was made. Abraham Lincoln, I mean, a nobody, a one-term congressman, just suddenly was the right man at the right time. Same thing you could say about, George Washington in a way. But that's my point.
Is it during the crisis, is it the gray prophet that becomes the leader, or it could be executed by the or the nomads?
So
then the millennials do the fighting?
So the gray champion is the sort of the elder prophet.
Yes.
Now, whether that gray champion is also the supreme national leader, that can vary. It was true with Franklin Roosevelt. He was a prophet archetype. He was the elder leader, and the GI generation absolutely worshipped Franklin Roosevelt. And the same thing was true with Abraham Lincoln. And when Franklin Roosevelt died, the nation mourned for him exactly as they mourned for Abraham Lincoln when he died. I mean, that was the generation that all young people followed. And certainly all the Union followers, all the Republicans in the North, would follow Lincoln, anywhere. So, great leaders, made, not born, that took us through this harrowing period. Now, they were great champions. They were both prophet archetypes. In the American Revolution, we did have prophet archetypes, people like Sam Adams or Benjamin Franklin, but the one that everyone worshipped was George Washington.
He was a nomad.
Yes. Exactly. Another one would be Queen Elizabeth. And actually we write about all these crises going back, but another one was Queen Elizabeth, who was a nomad. I mean, Queen Elizabeth had a little copy of, Machiavelli's The Prince, right under. I mean, she was always reading, like, how to stab them in the back when they were licking and stuff. And she was a total pragmatist when it came to religion, right? She just wanted a practical way to get rid of this issue. So, but she was a nomad, right? So, typically it's someone who's an early-born nomad, or if they're a prophet, they're a late-born prophet. Someone on the cusp of the two.
I want to finish with a compelling future of the springtime, because it's not a year or two. Once we make it through this, then we have 20 or more years usually of a more optimistic time. Describe, what the springtime is to come.
The springtime, look, everyone is going to regard the springtime as a wonderful time, given what came before. And there would be no doubt about when it starts, because suddenly the great conflict will be over. It's when all the treaties are signed, all the resolutions are made, and suddenly it's a time when, after history moves very fast, it suddenly really begins to slow down. And when suddenly institutions can be remade very quickly, and new laws and so on, all this great stuff put into place, suddenly things become harder to change. Right? Now, socially, it's what millennials have been dreaming about. It's what GIs were dreaming about. It's what it's where we will have calm,
People unified.
Everyone will have a place. Everyone will be unified. And we will all feel great about our country.
Sounds impossible right now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But that's what crisis does, because people get exhausted with the emotion. These seasons, think of it as emotional seasons. And, you know, the optimism season, you go, go, go. But if you smile all the time, your face hurts eventually, right, after 20 years. And so people go through that summertime of that internal fight and looking for the individualism. I don't want to be part of the group. And then all of a sudden the unraveling happens, and everybody supposedly has the rewards, at least financial rewards. And then after that big fall of rewards, what do you have? The next winter time again. And now people come together to fight the crisis. And so this is the cycle of humanity. This is not just your cycle or my cycle. This is the cycle of human history. And when you start to see that, it can be compelling.
When you,
So I look at it, my own daughter, for example, and I think, by the way, what will be the next generation? When's the cutoff for Z's? We don't know yet, I guess.
We don't know, actually. We don't even know when they start, interestingly enough. You have to wait until the crisis ends. And let me give you a good example. 1925 is where the silent generation starts. 1924 is where the GI generation stops. You would not have known that until 1946, when World War II ended. So we have to wait until that final. But right now, we think that the last birth year of millennials was 2004. First birth year of our Homeland generation is 2005. But so Homelander is interesting. And the reason why they named it Homelander is, first of all, because back then, I think we did this poll in 2000, I can't remember, 2010 or something like that. But first of all, remember after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security, everyone was into Homeland, right? And also this fact that everyone was suddenly into sort of, protecting the home, protecting the community. And then the fact that literally, given these incredibly compulsively protective Gen Xer parents who swear that they're never going to allow their own kid to be left alone like they were left alone, right? Again, this pattern of overcompensation. These kids are always at home. I mean, they always have someone at home, and they never go anywhere. It's amazing. This generation they don't have to go anywhere, for movies, for entertainment,
for food,
for each other, for food, for whatever. So they are literally the most homebound generation. And during the pandemic, it was off the charts, right? So we call them the quarantines, right? Anyway, for a reason. So your question was, so that's when we think they're going to be done. And when with their last cohort, obviously, is going to be determined a little bit by when we determine the prophet, the beginning of the prophet.
That's what I think will be the next prophet generation.
But it's probably going to extend from 2005 to sometime in the late 2020s.
Yeah.
So, and we've talked a little bit about their attributes. Yes. They're going to be very well behaved, by the way. Young artist archetypes, very well behaved, very well socialized. And this is the amazing thing. And I maybe this is one point I should come back to, because I think people find it so counterintuitive that they don't believe it. But if you go back through all of history, going back to the 1500s to like the generation of Erasmus, you think about a very well-socialized, a very well-educated generation. But these generations of extremely consensus-minded, socialized, educated, erudite, young people who later on, deepen that reputation as they go older, they always were raised by very closed, tight-fisted, pragmatic parents at a time of crisis, right?
Yes.
And similarly, the most pragmatic, survivalist generations were always raised at a time of openness and chaos in their childhood, right? And I think that's what's interesting about that is you can see that they were raised you see that Jungian thing, that idea that who you are is almost the opposite of how you are raised. I think so many Xers today, they're so protective, so hands-on with their parents, and it's so obviously different. And by the way, when I talk to Xers, and I've done this a lot, and I've surveyed them, and I've talked to them, It's not even unconscious. It's conscious. They know they're doing it for that reason. Yes, damn it, I'm never going to have my kid with the way I remember, when I was home alone and stuff. So it's very deliberate, very conscious. And similarly, the silent generation, why did they raise Xers that way?
Yes.
Because of they were raised in a closet, right? Back in the late 1930s, 1940s.
It's also why oftentimes people relate more to their grandparents than their parents.
Yeah, exactly. And you see now they're relating to the similar archetype across the cycle. And that's what's amazing. This is why so many millennials admire their GI generation parents or great-grandparents because, wow, I recognize something in that, granddad, grandma, whatever, right? Yeah. So that sense. I think it was Igor Stravinsky who said that. We every generation declares war on its parents and makes friends with its grandparents. and that again, that's looking across the cycle at your archetypal similarity versus your opposite.
So the question is, where are you in the seasons of history? When did you come of age? That 21 to 41 range. So I was born in 1960, right on the cusp. So I can remember somewhere in my psyche that optimism for those first 3 years before Kennedy died. I can remember seeing Kennedy and King and all the absolute unraveling that occurred there. Robert Kennedy dying was part of my youth. And then I came of age in my 21 and 41 during the unraveling, during the fall, right? So inflation exploded, and then all of a sudden the changes that happened in the 80s and the 90s. And so now I'm earning the next stage of my life in middle of halfway through the winter. And, the next section of it, I'll get to see, hopefully, if I live decently, I'll get to see the next springtime, a good portion of it. Where are you in your location in history? And how are you going to navigate it? And if you only look at today, you're going to have the wrong view. When I say the wrong view, you'll have an inaccurate view of life. And also, many people want it to be easier. But nothing that's ever come easy has been valued very much in our lives. Your parents tell you that, you never listen to them. But as you get older, you know it. And so these years that'll be challenging over the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years, whatever it really is, challenging financially, challenging in terms of uncertainty, they're also going to make us have to be more nimble, make us grow in ways that you wouldn't have to grow without it. And on the other side of it, you have 10 or 20 or 30 years, whatever it'll be for you, of great deal of optimism. And then what'll happen is there'll be another summer. There'll be another awakening, internal battle. And I don't know how long you're going to live, but it'll be interesting. I think about my daughter and think about what she'll go into. She's going to, be a child during the crisis, at least half of it. She'll come of age in this beautiful springtime. She'll participate probably in the next summer, and if she's lucky, she'll make it in the fall. Maybe she has a long life. Maybe she'll make it to the next winter and take what she learns from that. There's a beauty in understanding life from a different perspective than just how you're looking at it right now. And that beauty you've brought to all of us today.
Tony, let me just maybe a couple of closing things.
Please.
I think it's important. People often, they listen to me and they will say, Neil, this just sounds so terrible. You're telling us about all these things, how fourth turnings usually end, where they usually go. I mean, we're talking about war after all. We're talking about conflict. We're talking about additional, economic times of economic financial duress. It seems so bleak. And then my answer is, what's the good news? What's the upside of a fourth turning? And I said the upside of a fourth turning is that we actually, at the end of it, we actually solve all the problems that we now have in a way that today absolutely no one thinks we'll ever solve. And I said, and maybe one way of saying this is, what is the worst future you can imagine? And I think you'd have to say maybe the worst future is take all of today's trends, everything you see over the last 10 years, right, that you see, whatever you're looking at, an indefinite future of that. That's a world without a fourth turning. That's a world in which winter does not happen.
Yes.
Do you want that?
No.
No, I don't think any of us. So intellectually, we understand it. And there's actually a fascinating speech. It's actually very famous. Many of you probably heard about it. It was William James. It was a great kind of pragmatist American philosopher. He gave a speech in 1906 at Stanford University, and it was called The Moral Equivalent of War. I'm sure the moral equivalent. Could we ever arrange sort of kind of a practice run where we could have all the socially ennobling things about a war without actually not fighting one? And it's fascinating. And he goes back and he finally admits, even though he hopes we would have one, he was a pacifist. But he says it probably isn't. He said everything we need to remain together as a nation, all the social habits, are forged in war, if we're honest with ourselves, or at least in conflict of some sort. I mean, he was trying to be as broad about it as possible. That's where we learn the value of sacrificing for the sake of others. But then he had this fascinating hypothetical question. I think it's really great for what you do and this audience. He said, there's something paradoxical in how we look at this. He said, if you asked Americans right now, would you have preferred that we had never fought the Civil War? Remember, he's saying this in 1906, so that's sort of like, not that long ago. And he sort of says, I'll bet most Americans would say, no, I don't prefer that we know. Because we couldn't have imagined the kind of dynamic, national, industrial, affluent America that we were by 1906 without the Civil War. Yeah. We had to fight that war to be who we were today. And he says he thinks that almost everyone would say, no, it was actually better we fought that war. And after all, we did do the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And, so all of that was good. But then he said something paradoxical. If you polled most Americans today, would you like another one in your near future? Almost all Americans would say no. And he kind of leaves it there as a paradox, but I don't think it's paradoxical at all. Because just like ourselves as individuals, we look back on our life and we think, that horrible experience I had, I was really down in the depths. I didn't know how I was going to go on to the next day. I didn't know how I was going to survive. I didn't know. I really learned so much from that. I'm a new person after that. I forced myself to change. No, I do not wish that I never had that experience. But then you ask most people, well, do you want another experience like that next week? And most people will say, no, I'd rather not.
And that's why springtimes last so long too, right? 20 years after that, where people don't want to go through that crap again.
So that's kind of the analogy, and I think we have to think of ourselves like that. That it's not that we want to be in a fourth turning; it's simply necessary. Forests need fires. Rivers need floods. The seasons need a winter. We have to kill everything above ground so that things below ground can germinate and they will have space.
Yes.
And that's another thing. We look at America today, we see the inequality. Inequality, by the way, always grows during peacetime. And this is, you go back to the end of the Neolithic Revolution. This has always happened. In times of peace and prosperity, inequality always gets worse. Why? Because families always want to protect their offsprings, and they're sinecures, and they all rig the laws and everything to help those who have. It always gets worse. What equalizes income? All the horrible things people don't like to talk about. It's the plagues, the famines, the total revolutions, the total wars. And same thing happened in the 20th century. That's when equality got much better. The 1930s, World War II, and then the high that followed. In other words, the ethos of equality after the war, these are the only times when our society becomes back to normal again. And then we can f*** it up again over time.
Creation and destruction and creation.
Creation and destruction and creation. But that's kind of how it happens. And that's kind of how it has to happen.
You are a special gift to us all. You've really delivered for us, as you have for decades for so many. Let's have it for Neil.